72 people boarded that plane thinking they were going home. 16 of them survived, but what they had to do to stay alive shook the entire world. This is not just a crash story. This is a story about the absolute edge of what a human being can endure. October 13, 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force plane crosses the Andes Mountains. The pilots miscalculated their position in the blinding white peaks. The plane clips a mountain ridge and breaks apart mid-air. Survivors land at over 11,500 feet. No heat, no food, no rescue signal. The temperature drops to -40 degrees every single night, and nobody on Earth knows exactly where they are. Now here is the part most people never hear about. The rescue teams searched for 10 days straight, and then they stopped. The government quietly told the families those passengers were almost certainly dead. But 16 of those people were still breathing up in that frozen wasteland. And what happened next over the next 72 days will mess with your head. If stories like this one, the ones they never taught you in school, hit different for you, then subscribe to History Lab right now. We dig into the real history, the raw truth, and the moments that changed everything. Because what you are about to hear next is not in any textbook. Let's go back to that mountain. The plane was carrying a Uruguayan rugby team called the Old Christians Club. They were young guys, mostly in their 20s, flying to a match in Chile. There were also family members and friends on board, 45 people total. The flight crossed Argentina and then hit the Andes, the highest mountain range in the Americas. The pilots began their descent too early because they thought they had already cleared the peaks. They were wrong. The plane slammed into a mountain at full speed, and the tail ripped completely off. Bodies and seats were sucked out instantly into the freezing air.
The fuselage, the main body of the plane, slid and tumbled down a glacier. It finally stopped on a steep snowfield, half buried, barely intact. 28 people survived the initial crash, but surviving the crash was honestly just the beginning of the nightmare. The first night, the temperature plunged so fast that several survivors died from shock and cold. They had almost no warm clothing, no sleeping bags, no winter gear. They took seat cushions and luggage and pressed together just to stay warm. One survivor, Roberto Canessa, was only 19 years old and a medical student. He started treating broken bones and deep wounds with almost nothing to work with. And here is where it gets really dark. On the third day, an avalanche hit. It buried 8 more survivors alive inside the fuselage as they slept. Now there were only 27 left, trapped under packed snow in total darkness. They dug out with their bare hands for hours before they could breathe again. The cold was so extreme that frostbite set in within minutes of exposure. They melted snow for water using pieces of metal heated by the sun. They had a small amount of chocolate, wine, and jam from the plane. That food ran out in less than a week. And this is the moment that defines this entire story. There was no other food source on that mountain, none. The survivors made the most agonizing decision any human being can make. They chose to eat the flesh of those who had already died in the crash. Now, before you react, understand what these people were going through. These were devout Catholic young men from Uruguay. In their faith, this went against everything they believed.
But Roberto Canessa framed it this way to the others. He said the bodies on that mountain were no longer people. They were sustenance left behind. He said their dead friends would have wanted them to survive. It took enormous emotional courage just to accept that reality. And this decision, as brutal as it sounds, is the only reason anyone came home alive. Trust me, the psychological weight of that choice followed every survivor for the rest of their lives. But even with food and water handled, the situation was still completely desperate. They had a small transistor radio they'd pieced together from crash debris. And on day 11, they heard something that nearly destroyed them mentally. They heard a news broadcast announce that the official search had been called off. The world had given up on them. Every single one of those survivors had to sit in that frozen darkness and process that. Their families thought they were dead. The government had moved on. They were completely alone on a mountain that nobody was looking at anymore. And here is where it gets really extraordinary. Instead of breaking down and giving up, they got organized. They formed a leadership structure, assigned tasks, managed the food supply carefully. Nando Parado, who had lost his mother and sister in the crash, became a driving force. He told the others flat out, "Nobody is coming for us, so we have to go out ourselves." 3 survivors made an early expedition attempt to climb toward the west.
They found the plane's tail section, which gave them batteries and some warmer gear. But the mountains were impossibly steep, and the weather was brutally unpredictable. Wait, because this next part is where human willpower becomes almost supernatural. Parado and Canessa decided they were going to walk out of the Andes. They had no ropes, no professional gear, no maps that showed where they actually were. They only knew that Chile was somewhere to the west, past those frozen peaks. On day 61 after the crash, they began their climb. They carried food, a sleeping bag they had sewn from insulation, and sheer will. The climb took them over a 17,000-foot peak, higher than almost any mountain in North America. They struggled through deep snow, sub-zero winds, and near-zero visibility. For 10 days, they pushed west with no way to communicate with anyone below. Back on the mountain, the remaining 14 survivors waited in silence and fear. They had no way of knowing if Parado and Canessa were alive or dead. And then, on day 71, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan spotted 2 ragged figures. They were on the opposite bank of a river, screaming and waving frantically. Catalan threw them paper and a pen across the rushing water. Parado wrote a note explaining who they were and where the others were waiting. Catalan rode 2 days on horseback to reach the nearest village with a telephone. Within hours, Chilean rescue helicopters were scrambled.
On December 23, 1972, the last survivors were airlifted off that mountain. 72 days after the crash, 16 men walked back into the world. The media went absolutely insane when the survival secret came out. Journalists were brutal, calling the survivors monsters, writing horrifying headlines. Some Catholic leaders initially condemned the decision to eat the dead. But honestly, the more the story came out, the more the world started to understand. These were not desperate criminals. They were sons, brothers, teammates. They had prayed before every meal. They had treated the bodies of their friends with absolute respect. They had survived not because they were hardened, but because they loved life enough to fight for it. Roberto Canessa went on to become a world-renowned pediatric cardiologist. Nando Parado became a motivational speaker whose story reaches millions of people today. Several others raised families and lived full, meaningful lives. Every one of them had to carry a weight the rest of us will never fully understand. But here is what this story really is at its core. It is not a story about desperation. It is a story about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that they are finished. These guys were not soldiers or extreme athletes or trained survivalists. They were just regular young men who decided, together, that they were going home. And that decision, repeated every single frozen day for 72 days, is the reason they made it. The Andes crash changed how psychologists think about group survival under extreme stress. It changed how the Catholic Church thought about survival ethics. It changed how the entire world thinks about the human will to live. And it is one of the most incredible true survival stories in the history of the world. If this story hit you the way it hits me every time I tell it, subscribe to History Lab right now.